Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by Dr. Carlo Lancellotti. Carlo is a professor and chair in the Department of Mathematics at the College of Staten Island in the USA. His main field of scholarship is in kinetic theory of plasmas and gravitating systems. He's also translated and edited two volumes of works of the great 20th century Italian political philosopher Augusto Del Noce. I'd love to look a little bit at this work today and the importance of Del Noce for Christians and for others alike. So we'll get stuck into that. But first, I'd love to ask you a bit about yourself, Carol. Can you tell us a bit about your background and some of the key events in your own life that have helped to form your love for Christ and his church?
Well, I am from Milan in Italy, and I lived there until I was 25 when I moved to the US to study in graduate school at the University of Virginia, and then I got a job and got married, and so I got stuck on this side of the ocean. And when I was back in Italy, my background is Catholic, and in particular, since high school, I've been involved with the ecclesial movement called Communion and Liberation, CNL, that you may have heard of or not, but it was started in Milan by the late Father Luigi Giussani, now over half a century ago. And this Catholic movement always emphasized the relationship with faith and culture. So since high school, with my teachers, we have a desire to understand the interactions between the faith and philosophical and cultural questions. And so living in America, I realized that there are some trends, some phenomena that to some extent Del Noce had already observed earlier on, because Italy experienced a big ideological wave back in the 70s and 80s, which was not the same as today's ideological wave in the US, right? It was more communism at that time. But nonetheless, Del Noce was a very observant thinker, and I realized that some of his thought would be relevant also to what's going on in the United States. So I thought I would do something helpful by translating.
Brilliant. And then I want to ask you a bit more about that then. So what was it in particular about Del Noce and his work that moved you? And especially then, I suppose, considering your expertise is in mathematics and what took you in that direction?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Of course, political philosophy has always been a hobby of mine. I'm an amateur. But, when I was younger, I was interested both in philosophy and science. And I realized that philosophy is something that to some extent you can do amatorially. Like if you have an interest, you can pursue it. While science and math have a strong technical component that either you study it when you're young or you really never do it. So I decided I would study math first. Actually, I studied physics first, and then I moved into math. And then later on, because of what I just explained, I thought it would be a good thing to do a little bit of work in a completely different field. And it's been rewarding. And also, I know the books have been well received. Many people like you have appreciated. And so it's been a good way to use some time.
Brilliant. And I'd love to speak a bit about your work that you've translated, The Crisis of Modernity, then today, probably mostly. But we can always hit on other areas from the Noches of War for if you're happy to do that. So, first of all, I'd love to ask you about this idea of modernity in De Noche and what are some of its greatest virtues and vices, then, respectively.
Well, Del Noce thinks that modernity is a bit of a myth, so to
Mhm.
speak. In the sense that, of course, there is the modern world means today's world. There is the contemporary world. We are all part of the contemporary world. And Del Noce was not one of those people who kind of dream of returning to some past. I mean, the past is past, and we have to live in our age, and our age has its share of troubles and also a few good things, and we have to try to sort them out. And Del Noce was not a reactionary, if you know what I mean, but he felt that for many thinkers and intellectuals in the last couple of centuries, modernity took a mythical, almost religious value. Like he uses the phrase, "It is no longer possible." There are some things that are no longer possible, like belief in transcendence, or a sense of the mystery, or uh, the idea that that there is some break, there was a break, right? Somewhere around the Enlightenment, there was a break in history and everything is different. The human condition is actually pretty much the same. But for this kind of modernist view, modernity represents a radical change in the human condition, a radical improvement in the human condition. For the Noce, modernity is just the period in which, after the Middle Ages and after the Renaissance, there was, in the Western world, there was a critique of Christianity, which he also calls atheism or secularization. And in a sense, this was inevitable, right? I mean, once Christianity came into the picture, at some point there would be a rejection by some parts, and there could be a criticism. And so modernity is simply the age in which this kind of confrontation between Christianity and its critics has come to fruition, if you want, has come to the fore. But that doesn't mean that modernity has an intrinsic value, that modernity per se is this new age, nor is it the hell on earth. I mean, it could be. I mean, it's up to us. It depends what we make with it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. And then regarding that kind of myth of modernity, I think a part of that, you even see it built into the language. You talk about the dark ages or escaping into the light. There's, as you and Del Noce hint at, there's a neo-Gnostic quality about it. Can you tell us a little bit about how, contra the kind of popular myth, that it's actually secularist beliefs that are really essentially lend themselves to totalitarianism in quite surprising ways, and how Del Noce sort of fleshes that out then?
Yeah, Del Noce has a rather sophisticated view of the rise of secularism. I'm about to publish a third volume by him called The Problem of Atheism. And Del Noce is this idea that really atheism is just the final step of a process that he calls rationalism. And by rationalism, it means basically all philosophical positions who believe that our human condition is normal. There is no original sin. People think, Del Noce thinks that the rejection of God comes at the end of the process that starts from the rejection of sin, of original sin, by which he means the rejection of the fact that the human condition is full of questions, full of problems. That there is that we are in a dramatic predicament, in a mysterious predicament in front of life that raises questions. So rationalism is the position that says that no, there is no question. Everything is normal. This is what we are. We're going to die. To die is normal. To be born is normal. The universe is there. There is no question of meaning, question of why. And so then atheism kind of comes at the end of this process. And so Del Noce thinks that modernity really from the beginning was the process of this development of rationalism. You started with Descartes, and then you go through various other thinkers, and then you get to the German philosopher Marx and Nietzsche. That's his vision. And so in a sense, the question is not to get stuck too much on the politics, because people sometimes get stuck on political questions, but to ask these more fundamental questions, right? The religious questions, the questions of suffering, the question of why we cannot create heaven on earth, right? These are the questions that, in his opinion, drive the different philosophies.
Mm. And then from a Christian perspective, Catholics, Orthodox, all sorts, then why must we go through modernity, as it were, as you say, not fall into this reactionary trap? And how might we do this in a manner that really contrasts with the progressives who clamor for this future that never will be, or those really maybe attempting to escape to a past that never was, in a kind of a crude nostalgia, I suppose. And I think here, as it pertains to technology, say with Luddites or some super trad folks then, and I suppose on the other side of that, what are some of the virtues of what those people are hinting at or doing, and how could they do it maybe in a better way? I think of what would a reasonable Benedict option look like, I suppose, or if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's $1 million question, €1 million. I mean, it seems to me that, as I said before, there is no going back to the past, right? I mean, medieval Christendom was great in many different ways, but it's gone. And so we are in this situation, and we have to figure out what is being asked of us, and try to bring our Christian witness to the world as it is, not to dream, because otherwise it would be kind of a dream, a utopia, or recreating a lost world. I mean, Del Noce was very critical of many aspects of the contemporary world, of the modern world, but he also said that we sometimes have to try to value if there is anything good. You know, we are not afraid of giving it some value. I mean, he was in favor of engagement. Del Noce was from a generation that grew up under fascism, and then when he was a young man, many people of his generation were tempted by Marxism, because, you know, people thought that in order to fight fascism, you could make an alliance with Marxism. Del Noce was in favor of having a more original Catholic position, and that is not just trying to choose between two evils, but to make present, to bring to society an independent, original Catholic perspective. It was somehow his generation in Italy. We had the Christian Democratic Party, also in Germany, so there was these parties, and he felt that at the time that was a good thing. Now, it's, in many places now, that's no longer possible. But I think that he would still argue that, you know, not to be obsessed by the adversaries, you know, not to get totally bent out of shape, always reacting, responding, but to try to offer an original Catholic perspective, responding when necessary, and also realizing that, you know, secularism is in a crisis. I mean, you know, Del Noce had a strong sense that in spite of the expansion of secularization, many secularists realize perfectly well that they don't have a lot to offer in terms of new ideas, in terms of, you know, of perspectives for society to move forward. And he saw that Del Noce kind of predicted, for instance, the end of communism. Very early on, he realized that communism was, in a sense, by criticizing the church, by criticizing the school system, by criticizing religion, by criticizing classical culture, it was facilitating the expansion of capitalism. I mean, he kind of perceived this paradoxical thing that if you have a revolution which is just destructive, but then to destroy is easier than to build. And what communists did in Italy, to a large extent, after World War II, was to weaken traditional social structures, but without being able to replace them. And so when consumerism and, you know, neoliberalism, all these new forms of capitalism expanded with wealth and, you know, various temptations of comfort and individualism, then the communists were swept away because they had not been able to offer anything better. So I think that really the highest priority is to offer something better. I mean, criticizing is good, but to offer something better is the best critique.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlo. And another important facet, I think, to his work is how he almost deconstructs the whole language, this kind of nominalist tradition that has befallen us, whereby we speak in these terms, progressive and conservative, and get stuck in this kind of myth of time that sort of suits secularist hegemony, I suppose. Would you like to speak to that a little bit? Because I remember when I read that in your book, I thought that was most important and helpful.
You're talking about especially about the meaning of the word progressive and conservative?
And yeah, and how even reading history using those terms and using these new words in a kind of nominalist way, I think lends itself to the dominant secular hegemony, I suppose. Does that make sense the way I'm phrasing it?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. The Noce thinks that often we are not able to define accurately what the conflict is, what the opposition is. And so we tend to define everything in terms of left and right. Or in America, we do liberal and conservative, or conservative and progressive. And the Noce thinks that these categories are inadequate. And the reason he thinks they're inadequate is because conservative of what? What are we conserving? Or progressive towards what? Progressive means to move forward, but you can move forward in many different ways. So what are you progressing towards? You know what I mean? All these terms are usually used without really reflection, without enough reflection. Del Noce in the late 60s already considered that basically there are two big choices that contemporary culture makes. One is whether by being human we are defined by our religious dimension, essentially. Where if that to be human is to have to share in a common rationality that can ask questions of meaning, right? So what brings us together in society is that we recognize in each other that we have these questions. And in order to describe this first tradition, he refers back to the Greeks, to Plato, and he says, in Plato there is the logos. The logos is this common rationality, this universal rationality in which we can know the truth, because there is such a thing as the truth, and we can all share in it. The opposite position, which is the one that kind of developed after the European Enlightenment, and then with Marx and Nietzsche, with many different variations, these are all different things, but with many different variations, they all agree that there is no such thing as a shared rationality. Ideas are just tools, right? We are just highly evolved animals, and we use all these ideas, words, for practical purposes. It's just a way of manipulating nature to our advantage and improving our life. But ultimately, we don't have anything in common, but we don't have, there is no logos, there is no transcendent dimension. Religious questions are meaningless. These are the two opposites in his view, and so in his opinion, there are political positions who recognize this level of humanity, and there are political positions who don't, and who think that, in a sense, because also the position of truth and power, right? From this kind of Greek Christian tradition, the climax of the human experience is to know the truth, to deal with the mystery of existence. Instead, from the second position, the climax of human experience is to have power, because and so this transition from truth to power for him is also a transition from philosophy to ideology, right? And ideology is a form of thought, of thinking, which is directed at politics, directed at having power, directing at changing the world. You can hear this all the time today. Right? We want to make change. We want to be empowered. We want to have power. That's what what Del Noce considered the modern position of just sacrificing the search for the truth, the search for the meaning, to the search for power. In his opinion, this is the decisive divide. And then all the other ones are kind of relative to this one and offer the words like conservative and progressive. They muddle the waters in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you, Carlo. And another most important point, I think, in Del Noce's work is how he recognizes that this is a recent secular Gnosticism. I want to ask you a little bit about that and how it contrasts, say, to the older Gnosticism, and why is it helpful to still keep this label in order to understand what we're up against, as it were?
Yeah, maybe we should explain a little bit what the word Gnosticism means. Mm-hmm. I mean, Del Noce actually got inspired to use that word by another thinker, the German-American philosopher Eric Voegelin. And he used it in reference to Marx, also Hegel, the German philosophers. In what sense? The ancient Gnostics had this idea that we live in a bad world, that there is two gods. There is the good God and the bad God, and we are trapped in the world of the bad God, like the Matrix, that kind of thing. And so that in the Matrix is a very Gnostic movie. So in this sense, then the point is to escape and to destroy the Matrix, right? But Vogelin and Del Noce see this in Marx, because in Marx never describes the world after the revolution. Okay? Marx never cares to tell you what he wants to do after the revolution. Why? Well, because the world after the revolution will be so different, will be so much better, that it cannot be described in terms of our experiences now. Okay? So there is a radical opposition. It's like trying to describe the world outside the matrix being inside the matrix. You have no idea, right? If you're in the matrix, you don't know what's outside.
Mm-hmm.
So in this sense, what you have to do is just to destroy. You have to destroy the matrix, and then you will be free, and you will find what's outside. You will find the new world. So to the Noce, Gnosticism is this characteristic of revolutionary thought, like communism, but also other types that we see today, of just let's first wipe away the old world, destroy the old world, and then the new world will pop up, will come up. And so both Vogelin and Del Noce talk about the myth of the new world. There will be a new world that we cannot describe yet, including morally. It's not even based on morals, because even the morals we have today are the morals of the matrix. They're the morals of the old world, right? Mm-hmm. So there will be this new world that we cannot yet describe or judge or understand, but we have to destroy the old world. So this kind of opposition is what they mean by Gnosticism. Since you asked about the criticism, Del Noce disagrees with Vogelin in the sense that Vogelin uses this to describe everything about the modern world. Del Noce thinks it's too much, that this kind of idea of a Gnosticism applies to a certain tradition like Marxism, and also his followers and predecessors like Hegel, but it shouldn't be used for everything going on in the modern world. Mm-hmm. It applies to revolutionary thought. Del Noce calls it the revolutionary tradition. The revolutionary philosophies have this Gnostic impulse, but it is different from the old Gnosticism of the time of the Greeks and the Romans, because at the time he says the Gnosticism was about the cosmos, right? That there would be a new cosmos. The old cosmos would be replaced by the new cosmos. Instead, after Christianity, Del Noce thinks that this neo-Gnostic movement shifted from the cosmos to humanity. The idea that after the revolution, after the great change of the world, there will be not a new cosmos, but a new humanity, right? That basically we are going to have a new type of human beings, the communist human being, or the human being that is freed today from sexual repression, or there will be a new flourishing of humanity if we destroy the family, if we destroy all this kind of old stuff which is keeping us down. That's what he means by Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm. And then, if it's not obvious based on what you're saying, then what is this integral relationship between violence then and this modern Gnosticism?
Right. Well, as I said before, from this neo-Gnostic modern perspective, there is no permanent ethical or moral values, because like Marx says, all moral values are a reflection of the means of production. I mean, they're a reflection of how society and the economy are organized. So when the society will change, when capitalism will collapse or whatever, also morality will change, right? So we cannot condemn today's world based on any permanent values, but just on the fact that it has to die, right? That's the only thing that we can say. This has to pass. We cannot, again, criticize the matrix with the morality of the matrix. We have to destroy. Again, the matrix has to be destroyed. So in terms of violence, this means that we cannot condemn violence based on some universal, eternal, say, the value of the human person. We cannot violate human people because they are made in the image of God. That would be a traditional kind of Christian discourse, right? That there is something sacred about life, something sacred about people that we cannot violate. That is not possible from this perspective, because all of this is going to finish anyway when we have the revolution, when the world is transformed. And therefore, violence is not intrinsically wrong. It is intrinsically wrong when it stops the process. It is good when it favors the process, right? I mean, and this is what both Lenin and Gramsci actually did say about communism, for example, that violence is moral when it helps the revolution, and violence is immoral when it hampers the revolution. And so you see that from this kind of perspective, revolutionary perspective, the value of violence is ambiguous. It's not completely necessarily wrong. It could be good violence or bad violence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Carlo. And another really fascinating point that Del Noce makes is how this affluent society then Marxism actually is fulfilled in this kind of alienation. And I want to ask you about that, and how does this then pave the way, this success of Marxism, as it were, pave the way for a kind of radical individualism and I guess a war of all against all, as you're kind of hinting at there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, Del Noce doesn't think that Marx is entirely responsible for the affluent society, but he thinks that Marx was unable to stop it, and in some sense, it helped it, right? And the reason he says that because, Marxism is the unity of two different factors. On one hand, there is this faith in the revolution, this Gnosticism, but then there is also this critique of the past, critique of the existing world based on materialism, what Marx calls, I think, historical materialism, right? The idea that, when people talk about religion, is because they care about money, or that all morality and ethics are just a cover for material interest, that really what Marx says is the economy, the way production is organized. And so, and this is something you see all the time, even today, is a Marxist idea which has been super successful, the idea that everything is a social construct, which has been constructed to help somebody, right? And then so when you make any claim that this is good, something that we had was a good thing to keep, said no, that was done to protect this group, to help this other group, there was an interest behind it, right? And so everything is relative in the sense, because everything is not, again, a reflection of some permanent values or justice or whatever. Marx is not based on justice, okay? Because as I said before, justice is kind of a religious concept in some sense. Marxism rejects the idea of an eternal justice, because Marxism believes in history. History will bring about the revolution. It's not a moral, we must have the revolution on moral grounds. No. The revolution will happen because that's the direction of history, right? And so you see, when you shift from a vision of the world based on justice, which is this kind of Christian Platonic view, to a view that is based on the direction of history, things become very different. So going back to the affluent society, Del Noce thought that by undermining permanent morality, permanent values with this critique, Marx helped relativism. Relativism means the idea that all moral values are relative to the circumstances. The circumstances change, moral values to change. And in Marx, that's very clear because moral values are tied to the way the economy is set up, for example. If the economy changes, moral values will change. If society changes, moral values will change. We hear that all the time. Society has changed. Our morals will change, must change with it, right? I mean, the idea that morals are tied to society and change with it is an idea that is actually already present in Marx, but it is hidden by this aspiration to the revolution, to the new world, to to getting out of the matrix. But Del Noce's idea is that if the revolution fails, if people lose faith in the revolution, like it happened with the communists in Europe 40 or 50 years ago, when the Marxists lose faith in the revolution, what's left is the other aspect, the relativist aspect, right? And so in this sense, Marxism, once it ran out of steam on the revolutionary front, really fostered a relativistic and materialistic mindset that was actually very favorable, very conductive to a more aggressive type of bourgeois, consumeristic, materialistic culture.
Mhm. And then, what are some of the steps that we have seen then towards this new totalitarianism as it's filtered through this relativistic spin off of Marxism, as it were? And maybe what are some of the most distressing features? I think, especially now, maybe in light of the whole COVID pandemic and developments, recent developments, maybe even after Del Noce's time with our technopoly, if we may call it that.
Mm-hmm. Technocracy or technopoly. Yeah. Well, you know, the Noce feels that in general, totalitarianism is not just about, you know, concentration camps or secret police, propaganda. Those were manifestations of totalitarianism. But deep down, totalitarianism is when politics invades every aspect of life, right? Everything is judged politically. So you go, you make a cake. Is this cake progressive or conservative? Is this white or black? You know, you go to school, the art, you know, today you see in America, everything is politicized. The arts, you ask yourself, is this white art, black art under the Nazis? Is this Jewish art or Aryan art? You know, so the definition of or in communism, is this bourgeois agriculture or communist agriculture? You know, you can try to bring politics into everything, and when you do that, then everything becomes. That's what it means by totalitarianism. But totalitarianism, in this sense, is also related, in a sense, to a lack of sense of limit, and in the sense that we can bring everything in line and make everything perfect, right? And so, in this sense, the Noce thinks that totalitarianism is paradoxically political atheism, you know, a form of atheism that is consistent in this sense of believing that we can fix the world by ourselves, that we don't need to be saved or redeemed or helped or anything, that there is no question that we cannot answer, that we can fix ourselves and fix life and change humanity. So if you have a consistent form of atheism without any sense of limit about what we can or cannot achieve, you see that then why should it stop anywhere? Then politics becomes religion, right? Politics becomes religion because becomes the avenue of salvation. If we are not going to be saved by grace or by sacraments or by a divine intervention of any sort, we have to be saved by our own action. But if we have to be saved by our own action, if you try to stop it, you are standing in the way of salvation, right? And sorry, let me move the phone. And so you see that there is a connection between this, what he calls positive or optimistic atheism, and then the idea that there should be no bounds to politics, no limitation to politics. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, in what ways, I suppose, does he describe that this modern scientism, eroticism, and secularization then are integrated and united today? And can you maybe share an example of how that's playing out?
Yeah, this is something that Del Noce observed already back in the late 60s. And, you know, another thing about totalitarian is that totalitarianism, again, does not believe that we share in the same rationality, right? Like I said, there is, you know, communist cakes and bourgeois cakes, Aryan engineering and Jewish engineering, right? When you do that, you see that basically rationality is always at the service of a political project, right? And so you don't need to talk your opponent seriously. What you do, you will point out that they're speaking out of their group interest. So, for example, in the 1960s, Del Noce observed that when there was the sexual revolution, right? The sexual revolution, say that somebody made an objection to the sexual revolution. They said, well, I mean, children are not going to benefit from easy divorce. Okay, I mean, maybe good for the parents, but maybe there should be some limitations keeping in mind the children. Now, people would not argue against this. They would say, you speak like that because you are a religious bigot, or you speak like that because you are psychologically repressed. So you see the shift. There is not an attempt at arguing the point. There is a attribution of belonging. You belong to the old-fashioned church, or you belong to the sexually repressed population, or whatever. This is very similar to what would happen under Soviet Union, when if you made an objection, say, to the government, they would tell you, well, you say that because you are bourgeois, or under the Nazi. You say that because you're Jewish, or you say that because this idea. You say that because means that I dismiss your argument by attributing to some prejudice that you have, that you are, that you belong to a certain group, that you have something to gain from having your opinion. So Del Noce describes this typical modus operandi, this way of working of totalitarianism, by saying that totalitarianists must deny the universality of reason. That must deny that you and I share in the same reason, and we can talk because we can convince each other, because we can see the same world and share in the same rationality. No, there is, again, rationality of the left, rationality of the right, and there is no common ground to discuss. So Del Noce saw this again in action, as you said, in the 60s, because especially with this scientism, this idea, that either you accept what we decide is scientific. If you disagree, is because you have some vested interest you're trying to protect, for example, or you are just old-fashioned, or you belong to church X, Y, Z. Okay. And you saw that in reference to scientism, on the sexual revolution, and also because for him the sexual revolution, what he calls eroticism, is tied to scientists, because what people would do in the 60s would say, okay, we don't ask questions about moral values in sexuality because we are not going to agree. So we are going to ask what people do. And when they discover that 20% of the people are attracted to this, 52% are attracted to that, and we made a scientific taxonomy, a scientific analysis, and then we dismiss all other questions. Okay, question about what's the meaning of sex, question what does marriage mean, question is there a relation between sex and children. You can ask many different questions. Now, these questions are forbidden. Okay? Totalitarian systems tend to forbid questions. We forbid those questions and we stick to the science, but then it's just what is called positivism, meaning that we just have the facts and there is no ground for criticizing, and so you cannot challenge what the science says. And Del Noce felt that the sexual revolution really operated very much in this sense of presenting facts and about sex without ever asking the questions of why do we do that, what's the meaning, what's good, what's bad, never asking questions. And so there is this link between scientism and eroticism. Then the third thing is that in the context of the church, of the religion, there is what we call theology of secularization, which is a kind of religious thinking that goes with this program, that doesn't try to criticize from a Christian perspective, to raise questions, but accepts that we as Catholics, we must follow the science, right? We as Christians, we must just be modern and not raise questions. So you see, all this is connected.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlo. And then I think another interesting point is that this modern Gnostic sort of worldview, or series of worldviews, we might call it that then, that they don't allow for universal reason, but then try and sneak in a kind of new universalism with this kind of a desire for world unification. So I want to ask you a bit about what are some of the features of this ideology of world unification, and what was Del Noce's response to that?
Well, Del Noce, this idea that, after the big disasters of the 20th century, communism, Nazism, fascism, after World War II, Western culture made the return to the 18th century, what is called the Enlightenment, meaning a culture that thought, okay, we had World War II, we had the Holocaust, where did they come from? And kind of the consensus was that the Holocaust and World War II came from nationalism, from romanticism, from identity, from emphasizing identity. So was, so a lot of the intellectuals in the 50s and 60s decided that the way to counter ideology like Nazism and communism is by wiping clean identities, right? By removing, by weakening national identities, and by going back to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment in its French and German version, more than the English and Scottish version, it was a culture which was very cosmopolitan and universalist, right? And that viewed belonging to country or town or region as a little bit backward, and that really we have to be citizens of the world, right? And so there is this idea that then was popular in the 19th century with Saint-Simon, that we have like an international aristocracy of scientists, entrepreneurs, technicians, intellectuals, that they are united in their humanitarianism, and they kind of are bigger than their cultural, geographic, regional background. And still today you can see that idea is very strong. If you go to some of these great world cities like London or New York, you have these people who they feel they have more in common. If you take a very progressive liberal person from New York, he feels he has much more in common with somebody of the same orientation in Frankfurt, Germany, than somebody in New Jersey, which is on the other side of the river, because there is this idea of having this transnational, enlightened, progressive class of managers and professionals and scientists and technicians, while you have what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables out in the countryside. So this is a bit what he had in mind, this return of the Enlightenment, so to speak. And I think it's still going strong, although now people are asking some questions.
Thanks you for that, Carol. And then how does Del Noce view authority then in relation to power, and how does this perspective differ from the kind of neo-Gnostics, the eroticists that we're speaking about?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because Del Noce thinks that there is a fundamental distinction between the two concepts of authority and power, because he thinks that power determines actions by forcing, by physical force. I mean, like putting a gun to your head. That's the epitome, the summary of power. But Del Noce thinks that since, again, the Greeks, in the Western world, there was a different notion of authority. Authority was related to evidence, to the fact that some things impose themselves on you, but the truth as a way of imposing itself on you, which is much more effective than if somebody puts a gun to your head, right? And that in this sense, the idea of authority was really the foundation of Greek and Christian and then European culture, because it's related to this idea of the logos, right, of rationality. And so in a culture that knows the idea of authority, it's possible to preserve authority and freedom, because authority does not violate freedom. Authority is something, in some sense, freedom has to submit to, but without stopping being free, right? When you see something true, something beautiful, you assent freely, and it does constrict you, but it doesn't force you. I don't know how to explain. Instead, once the idea of authority is lost, there is a inevitable opposition between power and freedom. I mean, we can still see this today, to the extent that people feel that, either you are a libertarian or you are a corporatist, somebody who totally believes in the power of the state. But this is just an example of an opposition that cannot be brought to a reconciliation, cannot be reconciled, between power as just power to force and freedom as freedom to just follow my instinct. Because the other side of the elimination of authority is that freedom just becomes do what you want, but in an instinctual sense, that everybody has to be able to follow their instincts without ever asking the question of, is there a bigger picture? Is this true in some sense? So Del Noce does believe that Pope Benedict XVI used to say that we need a broadening of reason, right? That the problem of our life, the problem of our time is not so much a moral problem, it's not that we are more immoral than our ancestors, or that we are bad people, or that we are, ethically weaker, but that our rationality has become very narrow, just scientific, technical rationality. And so when it comes to questions like authority, like choosing what to do, right or wrong, it's like our rationality is atrophied. And as a result, either we follow an instinctivity, like in all sphere of affectivity, sexuality, you have to follow the instinct, like follow the force, like Star Wars, you have to be yourself in the sense of totally do what you feel. And like Hollywood, there's this idea of in Hollywood that you have to follow your feelings. Either you do that, or you have to be kept in line with a stick, because reason is so narrow that it's impossible to apply it to the deeper questions of life. Does that make sense? And so I think Del Noce would agree with Pope Benedict XVI that our problem is to restore the full scope of rationality, of reason, as religious rationality, moral rationality, the ability to judge beauty and justice, and to come to a consensus reasonably, not either being forced or being instinctive.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlo. And then, in line with what you're describing there, I want to ask you a bit more about how this promise of happiness in a kind of nihilistic, Rousseauian sense, then how it lends itself to despotism, as described by Del Noce, and what then does an authentic, say, Christian response and happiness or joy look like in contrast to that then?
Well, I mean, I think that the correct response is to say that we are made for happiness, and to be human is to have deep questions about happiness, a deep desire for happiness, and that the Christian proposal is to propose to make sacrifices for the sake of happiness, right? That there is no opposition between happiness and sacrifice, that you sacrifice something less valuable to get something more valuable, I mean, and that Christianity is not this kind of Calvinist denial of humanity. I don't want to offend the Calvinists, but Christianity is not this denial of the desire for happiness. It's actually an increase of the happiness, because it says that happiness is greater. Happiness is not just that you have a house, a car, a wife, or you can make a list, but really ultimately happiness is infinite. To be human beings, to have an infinite desire. A desire for God Himself, if you wish, and that so to walk towards God is to walk towards happiness. So there is no contradiction between God and happiness, except that you have to make sacrifices. Because if you want to get something big, sometimes you have to say that you cannot just totally get stuck with something small, right? Sometimes you want to sacrifice smaller things for the larger things. And so this sometimes is hard, because you are attracted to the smaller things. All of us are attracted. We have desire for things that ultimately are not going to satisfy us. They're not going to be enough. We do that all the time. So I think the Christian answer is not to reduce the desire for happiness, but to expand it. And because of that, to be able also to sacrifice things that are not enough.
Amen. And then, are there any other key facets that you think are most important about Del Noce and his revoir that I've missed and that we must attend to, just that I haven't mentioned in this short discussion, I suppose?
No, I think you did a good job. Del Noce died in 1989, so now some things have changed a little bit since he was alive. But more than anything, Del Noce, to me, is significant because he was a Catholic who was trying to think things from the perspective of faith, and to look at the world. And he was very smart. It's not just interesting for Catholics. I hope I didn't just have Catholic readers for Del Noce, because Del Noce was more insightful than most people of his generation. Also because he came from a perspective of faith, of asking questions about the meaning of life, and And so I think it's important that we are kind of proud of that, that we realize that a religious perspective opens up the mind, right? Opens up the mind to look at reality from a larger picture and with a deeper insight. Because, our culture tends to think that the religious perspective narrows your understanding or makes you less able to see things. Instead, the Noce, coming from that perspective, he was more insightful than many secularists of his generation. Okay, so I think that we probably can learn that from him. To learn to bring our faith, use it as a tool to really be smart, not because sometimes we don't do that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Carlo. And then would you like to remind us just then about your forthcoming book and when that will be out and what you hope to achieve with that then?
Yeah, this will be my third book. I don't know if there will be a fourth, but for now, that's what I've done. The new book is called The Problem of Atheism, and it was the first one that he wrote. I've been going backward in time. And if anybody is interested in reading Del Noce, I would advise strongly to begin from the one you mentioned. The first I translated, The Crisis of Modernity, because The Crisis of Modernity is an anthology in which I chose and put together selections from different books. And so it's a little easier. Del Noce is not a super easy author anyway. He's kind of dense and intellectual, but it's very stimulating, I think. So The Crisis of Modernity is a good introduction because it's an anthology and it's pretty selective. Then the second volume, The Age of Secularization, is also an anthology that he put together, and already it's a little harder to read. The Problem of Atheism is his older book. It's very big, and it is more difficult in my reading, right? So I kept it for the third. So I would encourage people to keep it for the last.
Mm-hmm.
So if you benefit from the first volume, The Crisis of Modernity, then you may probably benefit from the second, The Age of Secularization. If you still like that, then go for The Problem of Atheism. If you stop, I will not be offended. No?
Wonderful. Thank you, Carlo. And then where can viewers or listeners then find out more about you and your work and follow you and what you're doing then?
I'm on Twitter. If you look for my name, you will find me on Twitter. I have a little web page where I put articles on Del Noce, but I seldom post it. It's called delnoceinenglish.org or something like that. But I don't have a lot of traffic there because I put 3 things a year. So I guess my most public presence is on Twitter if anybody's interested.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me today, Carlo, and God bless you.
Thank you for having me.